My name is Kendra, and at 45 years old, I thought I had my life under control until this very moment. I had exactly 1 hour left to reach the airport in time for my flight for an important business trip to London, while a brutal blizzard was burying the streets of Burlington outside. I pulled the heavy door open and froze, in shock. Standing there shaking violently was my younger sister clutching her unconscious son in her arms. She looked completely worn down, her cheeks hollow, her thin clothes offering almost no protection against the freezing winter air. I immediately realized the boy was burning up with a dangerously high fever because I could hear his strained breathing even through the howl of the wind. It was obvious they had nowhere else to go and were about to collapse right on my doorstep. My taxi driver honked impatiently from the driveway, which meant I had no time to ask questions or demand an explanation. Instinctively, I grabbed the spare set of keys from the entry table and pressed the cold metal into her trembling hand without hesitation. I looked straight into her tear-filled eyes and made a promise that would later seal our fate. Stay here for 2 months until he gets better. Then I grabbed my luggage and rushed out into the driving snow, truly believing I had saved them by leaving them in the warmth of my home. I had no idea that my act of kindness would become the catalyst for the worst betrayal of my entire life. If you enjoy dramatic stories of family betrayal and ultimate justice, please hit the subscribe button to follow this journey. Let's find out what happened next. 2 days after my departure, the silence of the house was shattered, not by the howling wind outside, but by the metallic click of a key turning in the lock. I had explicitly forbidden anyone from entering the property while I was away, yet the heavy oak door swung open with a confident arrogance that made my stomach turn. My son Caleb strolled into the foyer, dragging designer luggage across the hardwood floor, while my daughter-in-law Kylie followed close behind him, shaking the heavy snow from her expensive fur coat. They had clearly planned a romantic luxury getaway in my home, assuming it sat empty and vulnerable for their personal amusement. Their laughter died instantly when they walked into the living room to find Mallory tucking a wool blanket around sleeping Tom near the fireplace. The shock on Caleb's face quickly morphed into a sneer of recognition, while Kylie looked at Mallory as if she were a disgusting stain on the expensive carpet. Caleb demanded to know what she was doing there without lowering his booming voice, despite the sick child sleeping just a few feet away on the sofa. I had never entrusted Caleb with the responsibility of watching my home because he had grown into a man who expected the world to be handed to him on a silver platter. He always believed he was entitled to my resources without putting in any effort, while Kylie viewed my bank account as an extension of her own personal treasury. I knew their unauthorized arrival spelled absolute disaster because neither of them possessed a single ounce of compassion for family members who had fallen on hard times. Kylie stepped forward with her arms crossed tightly over her chest to inspect Mallory with critical eyes before letting out a loud scoff of disbelief. She remarked cruelly that she was unaware I was running a homeless shelter before kicking Mallory's worn travel bag aside with the toe of her leather boot. Mallory stood up slowly to explain that I had given her permission to stay for 2 months, but her voice was shaking too much to sound convincing against their combined aggression. Caleb laughed at her explanation because he believed he had a superior claim to the property, simply by right of birth and his mother's success. He threw his heavy winter coat onto the sofa right on top of Mallory's legs, waiting for her to pick it up like a hired maid. He declared that since this was his mother's house, it was basically his house, which meant Mallory had absolutely no right to be comfortable there without his permission. Kylie seized the opportunity to turn the situation to her advantage by treating Mallory like unpaid help rather than a guest who was nursing a sick child. She pointed a manicured finger toward the kitchen, ordering Mallory to prepare dinner immediately if she wanted to keep a roof over her son's head. She stated clearly that they were not running a charity, and she expected full service in exchange for allowing them to squat in the living room. Mallory looked down at Tom's flushed face and swallowed her pride because she knew walking out into the freezing snow meant risking his life. She quietly picked up Caleb's coat to hang it in the closet and moved toward the kitchen to start cooking for the people who were currently mocking her existence. Caleb and Kylie spent the next hour criticizing everything she did, from the way she chopped vegetables to the temperature of the house. They lounged on the leather furniture watching television at full volume while Mallory scrubbed dishes in the background trying to make herself invisible. Kylie complained loudly that the soup Mallory prepared was too salty and demanded she make something else, while Caleb raided the wine cellar for my most expensive vintage bottles. They treated her presence as a temporary inconvenience that could be tolerated only as long as she made their lives easier and kept out of their sight. I can only imagine the humiliation she felt serving them wine in crystal glasses she was afraid to break while they ignored her completely. The house was no longer a sanctuary for a sick child, but had transformed into a prison where Mallory was the inmate and Caleb was the warden. She worked until late at night cleaning up their mess while they retired to the master bedroom, leaving her to sleep on the floor next to the sofa. 3 weeks into my trip in London, the physical distance between myself and my home began to feel like a suffocating weight rather than a simple geographical fact. I sat in my hotel room staring at my mobile phone because my sister had not returned a single one of my calls or messages for 10 straight days. I told myself that perhaps she was simply overwhelmed with caring for Tom, or that her old phone had finally stopped working entirely. The gnawing feeling in my stomach grew stronger with every passing hour until I could no longer focus on the financial reports spread out on the desk before me. I decided to bypass her mobile number completely and dialed the landline at my house, hoping to catch her in the living room. The phone rang 4 times before someone finally picked up, but the voice on the other end was not the soft tone of my sister. Caleb answered the phone with a groggy and irritated voice, as if I had interrupted him from a deep sleep in the middle of the afternoon. I was immediately confused, because he was supposed to be at his own apartment across town, focusing on his job search rather than lounging at my house. I pushed down my rising annoyance to ask him why he was there and to put Mallory on the phone immediately so I could verify Tom's recovery. Caleb let out a long, dramatic sigh that sounded incredibly disrespectful, before launching into a complaint about how difficult it was to manage the property with guests present. He claimed that he and Kylie had graciously decided to stop by to ensure the heating system was working properly during the storm. I cut through his excuses to demand to speak with Mallory again, because I needed to hear her voice to ensure my instructions were being followed. Caleb hesitated for a moment before delivering a statement that was designed to manipulate my perception of the situation completely. "Don't worry. Mom, Aunt Mallory is just sleeping all day. She is very lazy and doesn't want to talk to you." I held the phone tight against my ear while trying to process the absurdity of his accusation against a woman who had worked 2 jobs before her divorce. It sounded completely out of character for Mallory to ignore my calls or spend her days sleeping when she knew she was living there on my charity. I wanted to press him further, but he quickly made an excuse about needing to check on the boiler and hung up before I could object. I stared at the disconnected screen, feeling a wave of unease wash over me because his casual dismissal of her behavior did not align with reality. My suspicion turned into genuine alarm just a few minutes later when my phone vibrated violently on the wooden desk with an urgent notification from my bank. I opened the secure banking application to see a fraud alert regarding a transaction that had just taken place at a high-end luxury boutique in downtown Burlington. The notification indicated that my emergency credit card had been charged for a staggering amount of $10,000 in a single swipe. My heart hammered against my ribs because that specific card was locked inside the safe in my home office for extreme emergencies only. Mallory did not know the combination to the safe, which meant that Caleb or Kylie had violated my privacy to access funds that were not theirs. I was still staring at the screen in disbelief when another notification popped up indicating a new voicemail from my neighbor, Mrs. Higgins. Mrs. Higgins was an elderly widow who kept a vigilant watch over the neighborhood and rarely called unless there was a significant issue concerning the safety of the street. I pressed play on the message and listened to her trembling voice describe a situation that contradicted everything Caleb had just told me on the phone. She apologized for bothering me overseas, but felt compelled to report that the noise coming from my house was becoming unbearable for the entire street. She described loud bass music vibrating through the walls until 3 in the morning and strange cars blocking the driveways of other residents every single night. The pieces of the puzzle began to click together in my mind to form a horrifying picture of what was actually happening in my absence. Caleb had claimed that Mallory was sleeping all day, while Mrs. Higgins reported parties that lasted all night, which was a mathematical impossibility. The unauthorized presence of my son, combined with the theft of $10,000 and the reports of wild gatherings, pointed to a complete loss of control. The most terrifying aspect was the silence from Mallory, because there was no way she would allow loud parties around her sick son unless she had been silenced or removed. I realized with a sinking feeling that my house had been hijacked by the very people I had tried to keep away from it. I could not wait another 5 weeks to return, because by then there might not be a house left standing or a family left to save. I immediately opened my laptop to the airline website to book the next available flight back to Burlington, regardless of the exorbitant cost. I packed my bags with shaking hands because I knew I was flying back into a war zone rather than a homecoming. 2 days later, after arranging my work, I returned early from London with a heavy heart and a mind full of terrifying scenarios. I had not slept during the entire transatlantic flight because the image of my credit card statement and the sound of Mrs. Higgins's voicemail played on an endless loop in my mind. I instructed the taxi driver to drop me off at the bottom of the driveway so I could approach the house quietly without alerting anyone inside to my premature arrival. The exterior of the house looked deceptively calm under a fresh layer of snow, but I noticed immediately that the curtains in the living room were drawn tight in the middle of the afternoon. I inserted my key into the lock with a trembling hand and pushed the heavy door open to reveal a scene that nearly brought me to my knees. The air inside my once pristine home was thick with the nauseating stench of stale alcohol mixed with cigarette smoke and unwashed bodies. I stepped into the foyer to find my expensive Persian rug stained with dark liquid and littered with muddy boot prints that tracked all the way up the grand staircase. My eyes scanned the hallway to see shattered glass crunching under my boots and a collection of red plastic cups scattered across every available surface like garbage at a college fraternity house. I walked further into the living room where I found my antique coffee table covered in greasy pizza boxes and empty bottles of the vintage wine I had been saving for special occasions. The most chilling detail was the fireplace, which stood dark and cold, filled with cigarette butts instead of the warm logs that should have been keeping a sick child warm. I moved through the first floor with a rising sense of panic, calling out for Mallory and Tom, but my voice only echoed against the walls of the messy house. I checked the guest room where I had left them weeks ago, but found the bed stripped bare and the closet completely empty of their meager belongings. There was absolutely no sign of my sister or her sick son, and the eerie silence in their designated room suggested they had been gone for quite some time. I returned to the living room just as a groan erupted from the pile of blankets on the large leather sectional sofa in the center of the room. Caleb and Kylie were entangled beneath the covers and slowly began to stir from what was clearly a heavy alcohol-induced slumber. They sat up blinking in confusion at the sunlight streaming in from the open door before their eyes finally focused on me, standing over them like an avenging angel. Caleb scrambled to his feet so quickly that he nearly tripped over an empty vodka bottle while Kylie pulled the blanket up to her chin with wide, terrified eyes. I did not scream or yell because I was too focused on finding out the location of the vulnerable people I had entrusted to their care. I demanded to know where Mallory was with a voice that was dangerously calm considering the destruction surrounding me. Caleb exchanged a quick, nervous glance with Kylie before he composed himself and decided to adopt a posture of righteous indignation rather than guilt. He ran a hand through his messy hair and let out a dramatic sigh as if he were the one who had been burdened by this entire situation. He walked around the coffee table to close the distance between us while weaving a narrative that was so malicious it took my breath away. He looked me straight in the eye to deliver an explanation that was intended to shift all the blame onto the woman who wasn't there to defend herself. "She stole your jewelry and ran off with a strange man 3 days ago." I stared at him in silence while my brain processed the sheer audacity of the lie he had just constructed to cover his tracks. Kylie immediately chimed in from the sofa, nodding vigorously as she added that they had come over to check on the house only to find it abandoned and ransacked. She claimed that they had been so distraught by Mallory's betrayal that they had stayed here to clean up the mess she left behind. The absurdity of their story was overwhelming because Mallory was a woman who would never abandon her sick child or steal from the only person who had offered her help. I wanted to scream at them to stop lying, but I knew that reacting emotionally would only make them defensive and harder to trap. I forced my facial expression to soften into a mask of shock and disappointment, as if I actually believed their twisted version of events. I told them that I was devastated to hear such news and thanked them for being there to protect the house in my absence. However, as I spoke these words of false gratitude, my eyes drifted to the overflowing kitchen trash can visible through the open archway. Sitting right on top of a pile of discarded takeout containers was a small orange prescription bottle with a white cap that I recognized immediately. It was the antibiotic medication for Tom's pneumonia, which was absolutely essential for his recovery and survival. A mother like Mallory would never leave behind the life-saving medicine her son needed, even if she were fleeing in the middle of the night. That plastic bottle in the trash was the undeniable proof that they had not left voluntarily, but had been forced out with extreme prejudice. I realized with a cold clarity that my son and his wife had done something unspeakable to my sister and nephew. That night, immediately after Caleb and Kylie fell asleep in the master bedroom upstairs, I crept silently down the hallway toward my private home office on the first floor. I locked the heavy mahogany door behind me to ensure that I would not be interrupted by the 2 people who were currently occupying my bed. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop to access the secure server for the hidden security cameras I had installed years ago behind the motion sensors. Caleb knew about the exterior cameras which he had likely disabled, but he had absolutely no idea that I recorded the interior of the entryway and living room for insurance purposes. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I scrolled back through the timeline of the footage until I reached the date that Caleb claimed the theft had occurred. I pressed the play button and watched in horror as the high-definition video revealed the brutal truth of what had happened during the peak of the blizzard 3 days ago. The footage showed Kylie dragging Mallory's humble suitcases to the front door before heaving them violently out onto the snow-covered porch like they were bags of garbage. Caleb appeared in the frame a second later, gripping Mallory tightly by her upper arm while she desperately tried to shield Tom from his aggression. I could see my sister's mouth moving in what was clearly a plea for mercy as she pointed toward the raging storm outside and then down at her sick child. Caleb did not show a single ounce of hesitation as he shoved both of them forcefully through the open doorway, causing Mallory to stumble and fall hard onto the freezing concrete. The most heartbreaking moment occurred when Tom tried to run back inside to get his coat, but Caleb blocked the way with his large frame and shoved the child backward into the snow. He slammed the heavy oak door shut and I watched as he engaged the deadbolt with a look of satisfaction on his face, while Kylie clapped her hands in the background. I sat there in the silence of my office with tears streaming down my face because I had just witnessed my own son committing a crime that was tantamount to attempted murder. I realized that my sister and nephew had been out in that lethal weather without proper clothing or transportation for 3 entire days. I knew that calling the police immediately might alert Caleb and give him a chance to flee or destroy more property, so I decided to handle this my own way first. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number of my private investigator, Mr. Vance, who had helped me with sensitive corporate matters in the past. He answered on the second ring despite the late hour because he knew that a call from my personal number meant a serious emergency was unfolding. I gave him the descriptions of Mallory and Tom along with the urgency of the situation, instructing him to check every hospital and shelter within a 50-mile radius. I told him that money was absolutely no object and that he needed to find them before the sun came up, or I would never forgive myself. I spent the next 2 hours pacing the length of my office floor while staring at the phone and praying that the freezing temperatures had not claimed their lives. Finally, the phone buzzed with an incoming call from Mr. Vance, who informed me that he had located a woman matching Mallory's description at a rundown establishment on the outskirts of town. He sent me the address of a place called the Sleep Ease Motel, which was known for being a haven for illicit activities and having utterly deplorable living conditions. I grabbed my car keys and slipped out of the house through the garage entrance without waking the monsters sleeping upstairs. I drove through the icy streets with a reckless speed that would have terrified me under normal circumstances, but my mind was focused solely on reaching my family. I pulled into the parking lot of the motel, which was illuminated by a flickering neon sign and looked even more dilapidated than I had imagined in my worst nightmares. Mr. Vance was waiting for me by the door of room number 4 and gave me a grim nod as he stepped aside to let me handle the reunion. I pushed the flimsy door open to be hit by a wave of damp, musty air that was barely warmer than the temperature outside. The room was dimly lit by a single bedside lamp, and I saw Mallory sitting on the edge of the sagging mattress wrapped in a thin gray blanket. She was holding Tom, who was shivering violently in his sleep, and her face was pale with exhaustion and fear. When she looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, she did not express relief or anger, but instead shrank back as if she expected me to yell at her. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes and delivered an apology that shattered whatever remained of my heart. "I'm sorry, Kendra. I didn't mean to lose the house. Please don't be mad." She genuinely believed that she had failed me by getting kicked out and was terrified that I would be angry about the alleged theft Caleb had lied about. I rushed across the dirty carpet to wrap my arms around her frail shoulders, pulling her and Tom into a tight embrace to share my warmth. I realized in that agonizing moment that my years of enabling Caleb's behavior and shielding him from consequences had created the monster who did this. I had focused so much on building my empire and spoiling my son that I had failed to protect the only people who truly loved me without conditions. I whispered over and over that none of this was her fault while plotting the destruction of the life Caleb thought he was entitled to. The next morning, I quickly took Tom to a private hospital where the head of the pediatric department was waiting to receive us personally. I had used my influence and financial resources to secure a VIP suite that was completely isolated from the main wards to ensure absolute privacy for their recovery. The doctors immediately started Tom on a strong course of intravenous antibiotics and warm fluids, while nurses attended to Mallory's frostbitten hands and general exhaustion. I sat by the bedside holding my sister's hand to explain that she needed to remain hidden in this room for the next few days no matter what happened. I told her that I was going to handle Caleb and Kylie, but I needed her to trust me and stay completely off the grid until I came back for her. Mallory was still terrified of my son's violent temper, but she nodded silently because she knew that staying here under my protection was the only way to keep her son safe. Once I was certain that they were comfortable and protected by the hospital's security team, I drove back to my house to execute the next phase of my plan. I parked my car in the driveway and took several deep breaths to compose my facial features into a mask of exhaustion and resignation instead of the burning rage I truly felt. I needed Caleb and Kylie to believe that I was a broken woman who had been deeply hurt by her sister's betrayal and was looking for solace in her remaining family. I walked into the kitchen to find them rummaging through the refrigerator for breakfast, without a care in the world about the devastation they had caused just days prior. They both froze when I entered, but relaxed visibly when they saw the soft and apologetic expression I had plastered onto my face. I sat down heavily at the kitchen island and let out a long, trembling sigh while rubbing my temples as if I were suffering from a severe migraine. I apologized quietly for my frantic behavior the previous day and told them that the shock of Mallory's theft had simply been too much for me to handle after my stressful trip. I lied smoothly that I had gone to the police station to file a report against her, but that the officers said it would be difficult to track her down since she had likely fled the state. Caleb immediately jumped on this opportunity to validate his lie by nodding enthusiastically and adding more fabricated details about how suspicious she had acted before she left. I forced myself to nod along with his fiction while digging my fingernails into my palms under the counter to keep from screaming at him. I then shifted the conversation to the topic of my own health, which immediately grabbed their undivided attention like sharks smelling blood in the water. I told them that the stress of running the import business combined with this family tragedy had taken a severe toll on my heart and blood pressure. I explained that my doctor had advised me to step down from my leadership role immediately and retire to a warmer climate to preserve my remaining health. I watched their eyes widen with greed as I mentioned that I needed to offload my assets, including this house and my investment accounts, because I wanted a simpler life. I looked directly at Caleb to tell him that despite his past mistakes, I realized he was the only family I had left who truly cared about protecting my legacy. The transformation in their demeanor was instantaneous and disgusting as they shifted from defensive squatters to doting children within a fraction of a second. Kylie walked over to place a comforting hand on my shoulder with a smile that was so fake it made my skin crawl. She looked at me with wide, innocent eyes to deliver the lines that confirmed she was exactly the kind of predator I thought she was. "You really should rest, Mom. We can take care of the house properly, unlike that ungrateful Mallory." I smiled weakly at her while internally noting that her confidence would be the very thing that destroyed her in the end. I told them that if they were willing to take on the responsibility, I would contact my lawyer, Mr. Henderson, to draw up the transfer papers immediately. I explained that I wanted to sign over the deed to the house and give Caleb power of attorney over my accounts, so I wouldn't have to worry about managing them anymore. Caleb looked like he had just won the lottery and practically stumbled over his own words to assure me that he was ready to step up and be the man of the house. He promised that he would take care of everything and that I would never have to lift a finger again, which was ironically true, but not in the way he imagined. I told them that such a momentous occasion deserved a proper celebration and that I wanted to host a formal dinner this coming Saturday evening. I instructed them to dress in their finest clothes because Mr. Henderson would be joining us to oversee the official signing of the documents. I emphasized that this dinner would mark the beginning of their new life as the owners of this estate and the end of my burden. They eagerly agreed to handle all the preparations for the meal, wanting to prove their worthiness, now that a multi-million-dollar reward was dangling in front of their faces. I watched them high-five each other when they thought I wasn't looking, and felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. They were so blinded by the prospect of easy wealth that they never stopped to question why I had forgiven them so quickly. They were walking willingly into the trap I had set, and by the time they realized the truth, it would be far too late for them to escape the consequences of their cruelty. 7 p.m. on Saturday, the dining table was filled with expensive dishes that Kylie had ordered from the finest catering service in the city using my money. Caleb sat at the head of the table wearing a new tailored suit that he had likely purchased with my stolen credit card just hours before the event. The atmosphere in the room was electric with their greed, because they believed that the thick leather folder sitting next to the wine bottle contained the keys to their kingdom. They exchanged excited glances every time the doorbell rang, assuming it was the final step in their ascension to wealth and power. Mr. Henderson arrived exactly on time, carrying his briefcase with the solemn gravity of a man who was about to deliver a death sentence, rather than a gift. Caleb practically jumped out of his chair to welcome the attorney and offered him a glass of champagne with a charming smile that looked completely out of place on his face. Mr. Henderson declined the drink with a polite nod and took his seat at the opposite end of the table without saying a word to the young couple. I stood up to propose a toast and tapped my crystal glass with a spoon to command the attention of everyone in the room. I announced that before we signed the papers transferring ownership of the estate, I wanted to share a very special family memory with them. Caleb and Kylie leaned forward with expectant smiles, assuming I was going to play a slideshow of childhood photos or a sentimental tribute to our bond. I picked up the remote control lying on the sideboard, but instead of selecting the playlist of classical music, I navigated directly to the input for the home security system. The large television screen mounted above the fireplace flickered to life and displayed the high-definition footage of the front porch from 3 nights ago. The smiles on their faces vanished instantly as they watched themselves throwing Mallory's bags into the snow and physically shoving a sick child out into the blizzard. The silence in the dining room was absolute and terrifying, as the only sound was the howling wind coming from the speakers of the television. I paused the video right at the moment Caleb locked the deadbolt and turned to face the 2 monsters sitting at my table. Caleb looked as if he had been struck physically in the chest, and his face drained of all color until he looked like a ghost in a designer suit. Kylie began to hyperventilate and knocked over her water glass, causing liquid to spill across the expensive tablecloth she had been so proud of. They tried to stammer out excuses about context and misunderstandings, but their words died in their throats under my withering glare. I walked slowly around the table until I was standing directly behind Caleb and placed a hand on the back of his chair. I leaned down to whisper in his ear that I knew about the $10,000 he had stolen to fund Kylie's shopping spree while his cousin was freezing in a motel. I pulled the credit card statement from my pocket and slammed it onto the table next to the image of Tom shivering in the snow on the screen. The contrast between their selfish indulgence and their cruelty toward a vulnerable family member was laid bare for the lawyer and the world to see. I looked directly into my son's eyes to deliver the question that had been burning in my soul since I found the pill bottle in the trash. You left a sick child to freeze in the snow just to buy designer bags. Is that how I raised you? Caleb flinched as if I had slapped him and looked down at his lap, unable to meet the gaze of the mother he had disappointed so thoroughly. Kylie burst into tears and tried to grab my hand to beg for forgiveness, but I pulled away from her touch as if she were contagious. I signaled to Mr. Henderson, who opened his briefcase to reveal that the documents inside were not transfer papers, but a revised last will and testament. He cleared his throat and began to read the new clauses in a monotone voice that made the words sound even more final and devastating. He announced that effective immediately, Caleb was removed as a beneficiary from all of my insurance policies and investment accounts, without exception. The lawyer continued to explain that the power of attorney had been revoked and that I was filing criminal charges for credit card fraud and elder abuse. The look of horror on Caleb's face confirmed that he finally understood the magnitude of what he had lost in his pursuit of easy money. He had gambled his entire future on the assumption that I was a weak and foolish old woman, and now he was paying the ultimate price. The dinner that was supposed to be their coronation had turned into their execution, and there was absolutely no way for them to talk their way out of this trap. 1 hour after the lawyer left the house returned to a heavy silence that was only broken by the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruiser parked in the driveway. I had arranged for the officers to arrive precisely at the conclusion of our dinner to ensure that the eviction process remained civil and that no further property damage occurred during their departure. Caleb stood in the middle of the foyer holding a hastily packed bag of clothes while tears streamed down his face for the first time since he was a child. He looked from the open door to me with a desperate expression, realizing that the luxury lifestyle he had taken for granted was vanishing before his eyes. He took a step toward me, with his hands outstretched in a pleading gesture, hoping to manipulate my maternal instincts one last time. "Mom, please, where are we supposed to go? It's freezing outside and we don't have any money." I looked at him with a calmness that surprised even me, because the love I once held for him had been burned away by the image of him hurting Tom. I crossed my arms over my chest and delivered the harsh reality that he needed to hear to finally grow up and face his actions. "You should have thought about the cold when you threw your sick cousin into it without a second thought." Kylie was already standing by the door, shivering in her fur coat, but her anger was directed entirely at her husband rather than the situation or her own behavior. She realized that without my financial support, Caleb was nothing more than a broke young man with no work ethic and substantial credit card debt. She whipped around to scream at him with a venomous tone that proved her love had always been conditional on his bank account balance. "This is all your fault, you loser. You said you owned this place and now look at us." The police officer stepped forward to escort them off the property, and I watched the heavy door close behind them with a sense of finality that felt like a massive weight lifting off my chest. I changed the locks the very next morning and finalized the legal proceedings that would garner Caleb's wages for the next 5 years to repay the stolen $10,000. The consequences of that night rippled out over the following months and reshaped the lives of everyone involved in ways that felt undeniably just. I heard through mutual acquaintances that reality had hit my son harder than any blizzard ever could because he was no longer protected by my influence. Caleb was currently working double shifts at a construction site hauling lumber in the bitter cold just to afford a small studio apartment in the worst part of the city. He was finally learning the value of a dollar the hard way and was forced to build his own character without my safety net to catch him every time he fell. Kylie had filed for divorce less than 2 weeks after the eviction and had already moved on to another unsuspecting target with a healthier bank account, just as I predicted she would. The atmosphere in my home transformed completely once the toxicity was removed and replaced with genuine gratitude and affection. Mallory and Tom officially moved into the guest wing, which we redecorated together to erase any memory of the time they were forced to sleep on the floor. Tom made a full recovery thanks to the private medical care, and now spends his afternoons building snow forts in the yard he was once kicked out of. My sister has taken over the management of the household, and her gentle presence has turned this cold mansion into a warm and loving home where laughter echoes in the hallways. I sit by the fire in the evenings watching them play, and I feel a profound sense of peace, knowing that I protected the people who truly matter. I realized that by cutting out the toxic rot of my entitled son, I had made room for the genuine family that had been there all along waiting for me to see them. This journey has taught me that unconditional spoiling is not an act of love, but rather a destructive force that ruins a child's character. By shielding Caleb from every consequence and giving him everything he wanted, I inadvertently created a monster who believed he was entitled to hurt others. True parenting involves teaching responsibility and empathy, rather than simply providing material wealth. We must always remember that the law of karma is always watching, and that cruelty toward the vulnerable will eventually return to the perpetrator. Caleb and Kylie thought they could abuse a homeless woman and a sick child without repercussion because they had money and power. However, they learned the hard way that justice can arrive swiftly and strip you of everything you hold dear in the blink of an eye. The most important lesson I learned is that true family is defined by loyalty and protection during the darkest times, rather than just shared DNA. My son was willing to let his family freeze to death for his own comfort, while my sister offered me nothing but love, despite her poverty. We must cherish those who stand by us and have the courage to cut ties with those who only see us as a resource. Thank you so much for listening to my story until the very end, and I hope it brings some perspective to your own relationships. It was the hardest decision of my life to disown my son, but I believe it was the only way to save him and myself. Do you agree with how I handled Kendra's situation, or do you think I was too harsh on Caleb? Please share your thoughts and opinions in